just in time for a holiday party. So we look for sponsorships for that party, and it's at Dorland's. You're welcome to come. There's information on that I can certainly give you, and please do just study the SMPTE website, and you'll see an announcement saying that that meeting is coming up next month. I believe it's on the 12th, if I'm not mistaken, but none of this could happen without our sponsors. So this is a plug for Carl Cavagnolo, who's basically taking donations at this time, and we're proud to have a number of people re-upping what they do with us, and it helps us all throughout the year to have these meetings and basically show folks what it is we do. So Mr. Furter, you're here. Was there something that you wanted to say? Yeah. Okay, please, come up.
Thank you, John. So in the past, when I was the governor, one of the governors here for the New York region, I always tried to report back to the section on what happened at fall conferences and at Board of Governors meetings. And now as Secretary-Treasurer of the Society, we just concluded our annual technical conference. Let me see if I can, where is my thing?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, I have a presentation. So.
Different presentation. Yes, separate.
Sorry?
Separate presentation.
So anyway, well, it takes 3 engineers to do this. I've been an SMPTE member since 1986, since I was working at Chiron out on the island. I've been very happy to be part of the boards of the Chicago section and the New York section, as well as serving as your governor, and now as Secretary-Treasurer for the Society. So this is the board as it's, and I highlighted in red the people who are representing you in New York. So Sarah Cutterly and myself. Sarah's leadership really made this year's fall conference very, very special indeed. And for those of us who were able to attend, it was quite an event. It was at the Westin Bonaventure in Los Angeles, our second year there from Hollywood. We had a number of really good talks. We had a full-day workshop with Amazon Web Services, as well as career guidance for younger members, in addition to the industry papers on high dynamic range and other topics. And the Thursday symposium talked all about the creation of the Apollo 11 documentary movie. And we were actually fortunate enough to be able to talk to the International Space Station, to the commander, and the 2 women who performed the spacewalk to repair the batteries on the shuttle. And the funny thing was that the delay to and from the space station wasn't so much getting from the space station to Earth, but going through all of Amazon's equipment. So 0.6 seconds was from the shuttle to Earth, and 4.9 seconds was through Amazon Web Services. So, and for those of you who might not know your governors, I don't think either Tom or Rose is here. But one of the other things I wanted to point out was that our brand new member is Steve Wozniak. We were fortunate enough to get him. He introduced all of the 15 new fellows of the society, including John Turner, who's a member here from the New York section. And he said, well, and you know, he made some kind of joke about joining SMPTE and becoming a fellow himself. And I shared a cab ride with Roberta Gorman, who's our membership director, to the airport that Friday. And she got an email that Steve Wozniak is now the newest member of SMPTE. So I wanted to show this to you. Some of these slides are from Barbara Lang's presentation at our annual general membership meeting. The society is required to have one every year. We have it during the fall conference because that's when we have the greatest concentration of members in one location. These core values were derived and approved by the board as part of the strategic business plan that we have in place to evolve the society and develop the society, keep us relevant for the next 100 years. As many of you know, we celebrated our 100th anniversary in 2016, and we're aggressively moving forward to still continue to be the standards leader for motion picture and television and new media. And as such, we developed our vision, mission statements, as well as our guiding principles. So in standards, which is one of our 3 pillars, our standards vice president, Bruce Devlin, is very, very active in updating the standards process, as well as updating our documentation, but also to start to discuss standardizing new technologies. Again, as we move into the more internet age, to make sure that SMPTE is deeply involved. And to that point, we're embracing new infrastructures like GitHub for the technology committees to get together. So it's not as important that we get hundreds of people all in one room, but we're able to engage the standards community virtually as well as actually. And also to develop technical specifications, which is geared towards software development. Software develops so quickly that to go through the regular standards process, although we have streamlined it and the last few standards have come through very quickly, still the due diligence and the review process necessary takes a fair amount of time. The technical specifications process allows us to bring these tech specs to the market earlier, and then in the future those specifications could be evolved into a standard. So we have a number of strategic liaisons to enable us to modernize our process, and we've been working especially strong with the European Broadcast Union and the Joint Task Force on Network Media. And as well, we have parliamentary responsibilities for the International Standards Organization. So we are a worldwide recognized standards body. And these are the standards that have been developed. ST2110, the Media over IP standard. It's very, very comprehensive, but again, that process did not take as long as some of us would have expected. We are, I believe we still have 2 -31 and -41 that still have to be ratified, but basically the entire suite of standards for physical layer, video, audio, compressed video have been developed. Interoperable mastering format has been out for a number of years, but it enables a content creator to take content that he would create in a digital cinema format, to be able to share it and distribute it in broadcast and other formats. And the extensible time label is essentially the replacement, if that's the right word, the replacement for dear old SMPTE time code. Because as well as it works in the new age, we need a better time standard. In the pillar of education, we have a number of conferences. I mentioned the tech conference, and for those of you who have been at NAB, we do the Future of Cinema conference the Saturday and Sunday of NAB. All of these other conferences are put on by individual sections with the support of Home Office. And I know we've been talking again as possibly doing a conference here in New York. We would love your ideas for what we could do in New York for a 1-day or a 2-day conference. Virtual courses. These virtual courses, I have to tell you personally, having experienced them, these courses are excellent. They are taught by industry leaders. As a matter of fact, my boss and I just started the high dynamic range class. The the feedback that we have gotten from the attendees of these classes has been very, very positive. And I encourage you to look on the website for these courses, because they're both, you can either do them self-directed or with the instructor, him or herself. And they're very, very valuable. In membership has been growing. The growth has been slowing a little bit. Some of us were hoping we'd have 10,000 members by 2020. At one point in time, I believe in the mid-'80s, we had 10,000 members. The membership still continues to grow. We encourage all of you who are members to try to recruit other members. 42% of our members are from outside the country. And the number that actually concerns most of us is 14% of our members are students. And we're looking to engage with students and young professionals, especially young professionals who have just graduated, to keep them in the society. Because to put this in perspective, we have 14% of our members are students, but roughly the same percentage are life members and life fellows. So we want to kind of tilt the scale more towards bringing in younger people with their ideas to further grow the society. Real quick, this is a map of all of our sections around the world. I'm happy to say, working with the membership vice president, the Chicago section, which had been dormant for some time, is back, getting back on its feet and starting to run again. And at the same time they were coming online, a new student chapter was started at DePaul University in downtown Chicago. And the number of student chapters continues to grow. As I mentioned, the Board of Governors approved a strategic business plan to basically to evolve the society and move it into the future. And these are the priorities that we've targeted, that we're working on. We're especially looking forward to working with partners like the Hollywood Professional Association, AES, IABM, to work together, as we call it, harvest the synergies, to develop conferences, educational programs, to engage a wider group of professionals. So to that point, we have, in our first year, we've done a lot of work, especially in launching the new membership database using Salesforce to enable us to reach out more completely and to all of our members and to develop new members. The home office staff has been really, really on board with monthly business reviews, thinking of SMPTE more as a business and moving forward with business plans. We have hired a new director of marketing who is working on working with us to develop the partnerships and to rethink the society. Our president, Pat Griffiths, and our executive director, Barbara Lang, spent time with the SET in Brazil at their expo. There's a large group of broadcasters in Brazil, and we've set up a joint membership arrangement where SET members can also become members of, SET members can become SMPTE members as well. Connect Tech Asia is a former Broadcast Asia. Our Hong Kong section usually participates, but this next year, the society itself will have a track of presentations there and hopefully in the future. We're continuing to work with London. We had originally started them as HPA Tech Retreats, but they've evolved into sessions at other presentations. And we're working with the International Association of Business Machinery on a knowledge exchange. So what we are hoping to do in 2020 is embark on a reimagination of SMPTE. Frank Kunkel, our Director of Marketing, has been working with us. We had a lot of talk about that at the board meeting, and we're very excited. We have already met with younger professionals to talk about how we adapt SMPTE to communicate with them, meetup formats, informal meeting formats, as opposed to technical meetings, perhaps such as this, but also to engage them in social media and bring them into society. Real quick, one of my main jobs as Secretary-Treasurer is to chair the Revisions Committee, which constantly looks at our operations manuals and administrative guidelines to revise them, correct them, evolve them as the society involved. And I wanted to highlight two members from the New York section have been very active members of the committee, and I thank them as well as the rest of the committee for their service. We've gotten a lot of work done. But one of the things that we did do that was very important for us was to include a diversity and inclusion policy, which the society, we've practiced these ideals. We just never codified them. So, so the Revisions Committee drafted this addition to the Governance Operations Manual, which the Board of Governors approved, that states firmly that we seek and encourage diversity and inclusion in all SMPTE activities. All members of the board, section leadership, event organizers, et cetera, are committed to this policy. So if you have any other questions about joining the society itself, about the society, anything else that happened at the annual technical conference, please feel free to contact me at any time, or Jeff, or John, or our two governors. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, David Leitner.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Leitner. I'm the Motion Picture Chair of SMPTE-New York, and I'm an active DP, which means that this subject tonight is very dear to me, very close to my heart. I want to thank Mark Foreman for co-producing this evening with me. I especially want to thank Peter and Rich Abel for opening up their facility to us, and that incredible space downstairs with the sets. I hope you walked through them. I want to thank our lens sponsors tonight, which is Ingenue Zeiss and Fujinon, for coming up and setting up downstairs. Mark, are the demos still available after the meeting?
I think they're going to break them down, but if people want to talk to them, I would request to talk to the director.
Thank you. And thank you, John, for that really concise report. That was kind of interesting. I want to make a few remarks, and you know, it's a good thing I wrote these down this afternoon before I came, because I don't remember the year at a SMPTE-New York gathering before. I didn't have too many, but hopefully I had just enough so that I can read this for you. These are a couple of thoughts that I had going into this meeting. The fovea. I'm going into the eye. The fovea is the only part of the retina where 20/20 vision is possible, where the finest detail and color are distinguishable. The fovea, though, is surrounded by the macula. The fovea is only 1.5 millimeters in diameter. The macula is 5.5 millimeters in diameter. The macula is the part of the eye that makes possible our sharp color vision, our central color vision. And it just so happens that 5.5 millimeters is the image circle required by 8 millimeter film. Not Super 8, but the original 8 from 1932. So our eyes are a teeny tiny format compared to the large format cameras we're going to be talking about tonight. Why am I bringing this up? Well, I was watching a recent episode of an acclaimed series on the USA Network, and I'm pretty sure it was shot with a large format camera. I tried to verify this. I couldn't, so I'm not going to mention what series it was, but I know the DP happens to be shooting another series with a Panavision Millennium DXL2. And that's a love child of a camera between Panavision and Red. that features a red Monstro 8K VV large format sensor. So I think my guess is probably accurate. The scene in question, the scene that I noticed, includes a medium shot of the two leads in a large, dark, underlit room. One person several feet in back of the other, both facing forward towards the camera as they exchange lines of dialogue. I don't know whether they shot with Primos or they shot with Super Panavision 70s. Those are both lenses for large format. But I'm guessing they shot between T2 and T2.8. Of course, the focus pulling centered around the sharpness of the eyes of each character as they delivered their lines. The eyes must be sharp. The point is, I've never been so aware of focus pulling leaping back and forth as the lines of dialogue were exchanged. You couldn't not notice it. It was very distracting. And that made me start to think. We never had to pull focus while filming an 8mm. Any of you who ever shot an 8mm, everything was in focus. And likewise, because our comparatively small format foveal and macular vision is of the same image circle, we don't experience focus pulling in real life while watching two people exchange dialogue with one another. You could say that the appearance of focus pulling is unnatural. Yes, we could stop down the large format lenses that we're using on these large format cameras by about 2 stops to match the wider depth of field of Super 35. Which would alleviate this issue somewhat, but in doing so, we might defeat the point of having faster lenses. So that's a dilemma that all of us who are going to shoot large format are going to have to wrestle with. What about the poor focus pullers? They not only have less depth of field to play with at wider apertures, they're required to hit a perfect focus on the fly for ever higher resolutions. Today, 4K, tomorrow, 8K. If you're a DP, you know that in 4K, even if you're a whisper out of focus, it's painfully obvious. Would you want the job of focus pulling for a large format camera? I wouldn't. Or is this an argument for AI-assisted autofocus systems, a new tool in the toolkit, so to speak? On the other hand, who can forget the 1962 film Lawrence of Arabia, shot in rich, glorious 65mm negative by Freddie Young? Or those exquisite scenes in the 2015 film The Revenant, shot by Emanuel Lubezki, Chivo, with an early Arri 65. See, that makes the case for these large format lenses and these large format cameras. And it's a case that's very compelling, as we're going to learn more about tonight. So welcome to the bold, new, large canvas of large format cameras and lenses. Our first guest tonight is going to be Gunther Nosner from Arri. We're going to go alphabetically, so it's going to be Arri, Canon, I don't know if I can do this, Red, and Sony. I think I got that right.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, David.
Hello, everybody. My name is Gunther Nosner. Let me see. I think I have to change my presentation here. Where is it? Slideshow. I see it's not open.
Thank you.
So I worked for Arri since 2010, when the original Alexa came out. And yeah, thanks. So I saw the whole evolution of digital camera from the Arri side, starting with the first Super 35 camera, which was before the Alexa, the D21, which was more or less of an exercise of how to build a camera. And I want to bring up a little bit of history. So 35mm cinematography was invented by Edison in 1889, so it's way over 100 years ago. And film would run vertically through the camera in an aspect ratio of 4:3. Still photography adopted this, and in 1913, Oscar Barnack develops the first 35mm still photography camera, and it's originally to make exposure series of motion picture shooting. So it was a huge success as an alternative to the larger still cameras. and the film would run horizontally through the camera with an aspect ratio of 3:2. In 1954, VistaVision developed by Paramount, they came up with this CinemaScope format for bigger images to basically have a better picture. But it was quickly, soon after, made obsolete by film stock, finer film stock, and in '61 it was completely dropped. In 1975, VistaVision resurrected this format for Star Wars to compensate in generation for loss in optical film transfer. So in 1985 to 1988, Arri also developed a large format 65 millimeter film camera. And believe it or not, only 10 cameras were built because 65 millimeter film was extremely expensive. If you look at the history of large format photography, only about 45 American features were shot between 1955 and 1914. That's about a feature per year, right? So it's not a great business model. Eventually, Kodak came out with 50-44 film stock, and Dolby introduced a 6-track sound system for 35 millimeter films. And so that kind of reigned in the end of 70 millimeter projections, which was 65 millimeter was always projected in 70 millimeter in theaters. So this format didn't go anywhere. So eventually in 2000, around 2000, single reflex cameras came along to replace still cameras, and Canon is a famous example of that. Between 2007 and 2014, Panavision developed a large format motion picture camera, as well as lenses. Red announced in 2008 a development of a large format sensor, and Arri introduced in 2015, the end of 2014, a large format digital motion picture camera, the Alexa 65. In 2016, a red weapon 8K full frame prototype was used on the set of Guardians of the Galaxy 2. And Panavision also introduces their Millennium DXL camera. In 2018, the Alexa LF was announced, and in 2019, the Alexa Mini LF announced. Do you have a question?
In 1996, when Arri released the Blue Heron, which was the first camera to record 4K, was that 36 by 24, or what was the size image sensor on that device?
That's a question that I cannot answer, but I know John Fowler wrote a great article in one of the Digital Times. There was a special edition about the Alexa 65 that has that article mentioning that dimension. I don't know.
I was just wondering if that was the first. That would traditionally be the first instance of large format cinematography.
It's possible. I mean, there was one prototype of that thing, and it was a monster, like a little mini car, the size of that thing. So you could not do anything with this thing. But it was the idea of that Blue Herring project was how far ahead was digital compared to analog, and the comparison of what does it take to replace the technology. And back in the day, it was way ahead of its time, but still too early. Chip processing wasn't fast enough to really process data, and also storage capability was not there. I mean, there were so many things that were not working in the days. I should have, that's actually a good picture, because there is one picture I remember with this thing. It's a huge monster. If you Google it, maybe you'll find it. So the Alexa 65 was basically born in 2015, I would say. And this camera uses a large format sensor. If you think about the Alexa Super 35 sensor, if you take 3 of them, if you put them sideways, you put 3 in succession, it's 3 times the amount of photo sites that this camera is using. And Arri has also reached out to the industry, the rental houses, if they were interested in participating, investing in a system that would be a large format digital camera system. Obviously, with the idea behind that this would be less money to produce films, but with the visual benefit. And most rental houses would say, no, well, we're not ready to invest, but we would be happily participate. if it's ready, if it's finished, and if it's built. So obviously, Arri Rental was offered the camera, and they paid for it. So this day, they're still paying for this. And they have the exclusive right to this. It's a rental-only camera. The problem with this was that not only do you have to develop a new camera, you also need new lenses. You need to have a recording device that kind of can capture that massive data. So over the years, since 2014, they developed a series of primes that would cover the 65, 2.39:1 aspect ratio. And it's a combination of still lenses that are rehoused in a cinema housing, from Hasselblad to Mamiya to Fuji lenses, Zeiss lenses. And it's kind of the only way to make these cameras have some lenses at all. And there's only about 70 Alexa 65s in the world. So over the last few years, a lot of features were shot with the Alexa 65. Here's a few slides I stole from their website, Arri Rental website. And then also this list is very long, and I'm not sure if you can recognize some of these features on the left side, obviously, but I counted there's between 12 and 20 features per year that are shot in large format, which is quite, I would say, almost 15 to 20 times more than what was shot in the times from the 50s to today. So it is a format that a lot of DPs have recognized, and every single time I talk to an ASC DP that has shot with the Alexas, he's so enamored by the experience of what the images look like. And it's something that I think if you go and see some of these features, you may understand what they're talking about, because it's a visual experience. So the Revenant here's on the bottom. I think that was the first thing that also David mentioned was shot with the first type of Alexa 65. At that point, the media was codecs 500 gigabyte media XR drives. It was later upgraded to the SXR drives that were up to 2 terabyte drives. So initially you would record only 10 minutes per drive. At 2 terabytes, you could record up to 40 minutes, so it was a big improvement. And of course, there's some features only select a certain sequence to be shoot in large format. That was kind of the teaser or the opening. And this is an example that they have on their website. Arri Rental has on their website. Also a few episodic features, maybe some of them. It's called Dark, it's a German TV show. There is also Altered Carbon, so a TV show on Netflix that also was shot with the Alexa 65. Later it switched to the Alexa LF. And yeah, this brings me to the latest 2 large format cameras that Arri came out with. The Alexa LF came out in 2018. And a year later, just a couple of months ago, we started shipping the Mini LF. But along with the Alexa LF, we also introduced a new set of lenses, prime lenses. They're called the Arri Signature Prime lenses. And a new lens mount. And I will talk about this quickly as my time is running out here. So the main difference between these 2 cameras, one has a lot more horsepower, and it can do higher frame rates. It can do also more feature. It has more functionality than the Mini. But the second we delivered the Alexa LF, everybody was asking, can you put all that stuff into a Mini housing? And that's what the Mini kind of is today. And we have one here today. Actually, there's 2. I saw Fuji had one as well on their booth downstairs. And you can buy them from Able Cine here or rent them. So what we introduced with the large format cameras is the LPL mount. LPL stands for Large Positive Locking Mount. And the reason we had to change the mount, the PL mount has been around for 30 plus years, maybe almost 40 years, because it's since the 80s. For large format, you need a wider opening. And basically, it's the same mechanical robust design, 62 millimeter diameter. But again, we wanted to kind of look forward and figure out for digital cameras, they work slightly different than film. And there is a slide later on that I will come back to why a larger opening makes sense. So this is not a proprietary mount. It is a free license that over 50 partners have signed on to, and you will see more lenses come out with this mount, as well as cameras that will have this mount. So why is large positive locking mount, why is that important for large formats? So obviously, the light rays from a cine lens, from a film lens, I should say, had nothing in between the film plane and the back of the lens. So it doesn't matter when light rays exit in a very steep angle. The larger your sensor gets, or your photo surface gets, you will start to see, especially with material in front of your photo site, you will start to see chromatic aberrations. So that's why it's critical to come up with a new lens design that has what we call a telecentric back, where essentially the exit pupil is further to the front of the lens, and these light rays exiting the back of the lens almost hit the sensor perpendicularly. So you're basically getting perfectly, almost no chromatic aberration in lenses. When you look at the Arri signature primes, there's just an example, and you look through the back of them, and you kind of estimate where the aperture is, you will see that it feels to be looking optically very much in the front of the lens, even though it's in the back of the lens. And that's kind of a thing you can try out here. We have a few lenses here. And here's an example this is an ultra prime in this case. You can see the idea of the light rays, how they would exit. And obviously, there's a lot of antique and vintage lenses that are being used today that used to be for film lenses that are being used and hyped up. Keep in mind, it will have its limitation because of this. So the Mini and the Mini LF, they both have, you can obviously use existing lenses. So this mount is universal also for older glass. You can take this adapter and you can then mount it into the LPL mount, and then you can use Super 35 glass as long as you get enough coverage on them. And you have to look at specific lenses, and then you will see if they cover or not. This is a slide that is kind of out of place here, but I must have mixed up something. So when it comes to data, that's another issue that we don't really hear a lot of stuff. We go always to larger sensor, higher resolution. There's a lot of data to deal with. When you're recording RAW with the Alexa Mini or Mini LF, obviously the RAW that we're writing is uncompressed, so it's a lot of data. We're not compressing this in the camera whatsoever, but there is, on the downloading side, there is what's called high density encoding. You can save about 40% of space by using HD encoding. So here's the Alexa 65 sensor. There's a picture of that sensor. Here you see full frame photo, the size of a full frame still. Here is the size of the Alexa LF sensor, or Mini LF sensor. It's 44, 48 by 30, 96 photo size, and it's slightly larger than full frame. That's why we call it large format. Here is an overlay of different cameras, the Venice, the Red, and full frame. And you see roughly their resolution as well as their area. You see here, the LF has the biggest sensor area of any cinema camera that is for sale, basically, second to the Alexa 65. And
65.
The Alexa 65. And this.
Phantom 65 is for sale.
Which one?
The Phantom 65.
Oh, the Phantom 65. Yeah, I always forget that one. You're right. That one is also there. Exists too. So here's the Alexa LF sensor. In the camera, there's 3 sensor modes. One is open gate, which is everything. And see the resolution here. Also, by coincidence, this is exactly the aspect ratio that IMAX is using. It's a 1.43 to 1 aspect ratio, which the IMAX has a few of the LF cameras that are IMAX branded, so to speak. And when they're shooting for their screen is very tall vertically. This is exactly their format that they're using. Then there is the smallest 4K format in the cameras is LF 16:9, and 2.39:1. Keep in mind the high-speed frame rates that are in here, 90 and 150, they only pertain to the Alexa LF. The Mini does not do these high frame rates. So here you can see the frame rates on the Mini LF. They're 40 in open gate, 60 in UHD 4K, and 2.39:1. So that's kind of the difference. So first of all, like Super 35 sensors, the sensor, large format sensor, has the same dynamic range as all of the Alexa cameras. We're using the same color science, so you can mix and match with different cameras. Even though they're not large format, it's usually not a big deal to have different cameras to intercut. The sensor has a lower noise level than Super 35, and therefore it's a higher usable sensitivity. I mean, we hear that people rate it higher than 800 ASA, more like 1280, maybe 1600, because it has the lower noise. So if you want to keep, what is large format and how do DPs really use large format? This is also, in today's times, it's kind of an experiment. So if you want to keep the same distance to the actor and have the same angle of view, you need a longer lens in large format. Okay, so automatically you have shallow depth of field. So this has some advantages because of that. It also has a more natural perspective. Altered Carbon is this show shot by Martin Algren. It's a good example of very, very shallow depth of field. It was shot with Alexa 65 season 1 and then Alexa LF for season 2. A totally different look can be seen on the Umbrella Academy. It's a TV show shot with Alexa 65 and LF. Neville Kidd and Craig Robleski, they use very wide lenses without a focus background, which is another interesting look that you cannot see in, or you cannot create in 35, Super 35. James Laxton, he's a cinematographer who shot If Beale Street Could Talk. He keeps the same focal length and distance in large format, so he gets a larger field of view. You know, this is kind of a bigger canvas, gives you more space to act in. Or Matthias Bouchard, he shot a film with Master Anamorphics, and he likes to keep the same angle of view and focal length, which means he has to move the camera closer to the actors. You know, so you get a more intimate kind of feeling in the image. So all these things play a role in large format photography. So with the Alexa LF, we introduced the Arri signature primes. There's a total of 16 focal lengths. All are 14 are 1.8, except for the two longest one. And they have a very timeless look with a very well designed for future display technologies, also HDR. They all come with a magnetic rear filter holder. And here is just a quick example, and I'm almost done. I know I'm over the time probably, about focus breathing. Art Adams shot this little sequence here out of his window. And it shows you kind of how subtle depth of field change can look like, you know, without having any breathing. These lenses are corrected for breathing. There's multiple elements that kind of move in groups, you know, and you don't have a field of view change. So did you notice it, how it kind of went back and forth? And here is also a different lens. And you notice this is a very close 14-inch shot of a chessboard with a 50mm lens. And here is the signature prime. And now if you're doing a focus racking, so this is the, is it playing? So here we go. You see how the field of view changes, and you see how the whole image breathes, So when you have it with a signature prime, and you do this, you barely notice that the image changes. It's kind of a thing that you have to think about what distracts the image, and that may play into what David was mentioning about focus racking. Oftentimes, it may jump at you, why is this so distracting, or what am I looking at? No, because you're not looking at the film when this happens. you're looking at what the heck's going on here. And this is why you have to think for large format. We had to come out with these new lenses. So you can obviously get different looks out of these lenses. So here's an 18mm wide-angle lens, wide open, and T1.8 and T11. And you see kind of the background is softer, and also the light has like a soft glow, and versus a very sharp sunburst. Obviously, you can use these lenses on any other camera. There are adapters, LPL adapters for the Reds, the Sonys, the Canons. So here's just a few still shots. This is the Venice 5.7K, shot with the 58 at the T4. Here is the Monstro 8K, 58 T4. Here's the Red Helium 8K in HD. And you see there's a 47mm lens, so you're using a wider lens to get the same field of view. And here's the Red Gemini, 4.8K. So what's a little bit confusing, and what you have to kind of think about when you're shooting large format, we have something like the illumination guide online that has a very big library of lenses where you can go there. You select what camera you're using in which sensor format, and then you have to figure out, do these lenses cover? Will they vignette? Because there's a lot of lenses will cover UHD 4K. The wider ones will not cover, they will start to vignette. So I'll keep it at this. I know I ran over time, but that's all I have for you.
Larry? You're on. Larry needs no introduction, but go ahead and introduce yourself.
The ancient from Canon. If you can find, where do I find my, very good. My talk will focus a lot on the camera, the sensor, rather than the lenses. You know, we're big in lenses, but I thought it might give you a background on all the technologies that underline contemporary image sensors today, and of course large format is the hot one of the time. Now David had sent out this to all of the speakers tonight and said, this is what I'd like you to address, so I will address these from the point of view of the sensor rather rapidly. And I'll do it in the context of our latest full frame camera, the new C500 Mark II, which is downstairs if you want to see it. It's a remarkable little camera. It's got a little basic unit there, full frame, 6K, raw recording right inside that little box, no external recorder, up to 30 frames at 12 bits, up to 60 frames at 10 bits, and it goes on and on. It also has XFAVC recording inside it. It's extremely modular. You can build it up into all sorts of systems for television production, commercial production, and movie making. So that's enough about the actual unit itself. Now, full frame, the traditional that's used and was spoken to a moment ago, the 1.5 to 1 aspect ratio. We decided on a small variation on that. You can see that that's not a 1.5 aspect ratio, and that's why it looks like that. Now, please note that the image circle hasn't changed. It's essentially the same. So it's the same full frame image circle, but we changed the aspect ratio to 17:9 rather than the 1.5. And the reason for that, of course, is we are into motion imaging, not still imaging, and we are addressing standards today for DCI, cinematography, and UHD. The other reason is we don't want to crop when we go to 17:9. We'd rather use all of the photo sites to give you that 17:9 rather than chiseling it out of the 1.5 to 1 aspect ratio. Now here's the dimensions. The little black rectangle outside is the outer side. The active picture is the inner colored rectangle that you see there. And you can see it's almost 6K across and a little over 3K vertically. Now David asked, what are the advantages of these? Well, you can see that it's larger than Super 35. If you make the calculations on area, it comes out that the full frame 17 by 9 is 2.1 times larger than the 4K you would get with a Super 35. I'll come back to that because this is important. But now David also asked, are they more light sensitive? Well, in our case, we kept the same photodiode size that we have in the Super 35 millimeter C700. When we jumped up to full frame 6K, we kept that same size. That gives us our low noise and our high dynamic range. And of course, we're able to do that because we do have that larger canvas, if you will, of the full frame. And I do stress this business of a canvas because, as I'll show you in a few moments, if it's a canvas, the brush, and there are many brushes, is the lens. And it's the combination of the lens with this larger canvas that allows more degrees of freedom in imaging. The question David asked was, do they require more resolving power? Well, here's Super 35, the image sensor, which sort of determines what your resolution is going to be. You then hang a lens on it, a Super 35 millimeter lens, and you make the little calculation for Nyquist, and it comes out at 78.12 lines per millimeter. We always round that out and say it's 80 line pairs per millimeter. Now let's jump to the larger 17 by 9, 6K, and do the same calculation, and guess what? It comes out at 78.1. So the answer is no. The resolution per unit area for the lens is the same, but the lens is bigger. The image circle is bigger. Now, what's the impact on image size? And this is the important part. Here I have over there a full frame on the top right, image sensor, and I've got another camera which is a Super 35. I put them side by side, and I have framed them both. I've adjusted their focal lengths so they each capture that full image. They both have the same framing. And under those conditions, the Super 35 will have the shorter focal length, giving it a longer depth of field. And that's what the whole issue about depth of field is about. It's the focal length of the lens as it's adjusting to different image sensor sizes that is giving you that variation in depth of field. Now, of course, there's other variables. The aperture comes in, and the shutters come in, and you can do all sorts of things to play with all of this. But this was a little simple test we did where we had a full frame and a Super 35 millimeter camera side by side, and we adjusted the focal lengths to frame the same picture. The lights behind the young lady are very close to her, actually, and you can see in the Super 35, they are more pinpoint, and the bokeh gets a little larger with the full frame. And you can see the difference in the same subject distance and the shorter focal length of the Super 35. This is what we did at IBC last year. We put the two cameras side by side and tried to frame them for the same image size as best we could. I just draw your attention to the bokeh and to the out of focus of this object here. And then when we go to the full frame, you see the bokeh get larger. The image is very difficult to get them the same because the cameras are angled. But you can see the larger bokeh. So that's the big difference. Now, if you put the two of them side by side and you adjust them for the same focal length, and they are the same distance from the subject, under those conditions, you get a larger picture on the full frame. You capture more picture. And that's where the big discussion comes in. So here's a scene, and I'm going to capture it with the full frame. If I put a lens on that same camera, a Super 35 millimeter lens, at the same focal length, it would capture that. And remember I said before, the difference in area between the two is 2.1 times more picture content in the full frame. And you could see what that means. If you examine that, there's an awful lot more stuff, image content. And then, of course, depending on the lenses that you play with, the distances of the subject, the focal lengths that you send, you could do this, which is Super 35, could become that. The resolution per unit area hasn't changed. I've had to frame it a little bit to get a sensible picture. But you can see that you get a totally different picture content. A wide-angle shot can become really wide-angle. 2.1 times more picture content area. So it is this bigger canvas, a lot more room. You go a really wide-angle shot, and now you can bring in the Pacific and the Atlantic. Now, David asked a key question. if you are going to move into this arena of shorter and shorter depths of field, what can you do about helping the poor fellow that's trying to do the 4K and 6K resolution? Well, we have built into our image sensor, something I'm sure you've heard about, the dual pixel autofocus. Every single photo site has 2 photodiodes. And that was originally done to give us greater dynamic range because we can read out faster from the 2 photodiodes and scoop out all the electrons and get the dynamic range up. That was the initial agenda. And then following a couple of years of R&D and processing, our folks said, guess what? We've got those photodiodes in there. We can do phase comparison inside every photo site. And we got 18 million photo sites in this large frame image sensor. And so that gives you just a pictorial representation. So that's what we do. In the image sensor, we do phase comparison. We read out the 2 images from each photodiode. One of them goes off to the camera processing to make the video. The other one goes into a digital data processor. And from that phase comparison, we're able to create a control signal which goes back to control the focusing on the lens. But the fact that the measurement is made inside the image sensor allows you to get extremely precise focus. Now, having said all that, a lot of people, and by the way, we can do the autofocus with touch from the monitor. We can select with face detection. We cover about 80% of the area of the image, can be selected. And you can control, if you put that thing up on a drone, and you can because it's only 3.8 pounds, you can control from a tablet, the autofocus. Now we know that not all DPs like autofocus, no matter how good it is. So we then give you a variation on this using the same measurement inside the image sensor, but instead of taking the data around to control the lens, we reprocess data another way and send it to the viewfinder. And now you look at the viewfinder and you'll see this cursor and these arrows. So before you touch that focus control manually, you are told which direction to turn. There's no hunting. It tells you go forward or go backward. And as soon as you then do your manual focus, your rack focus or whatever, at the moment you get her nose into sharp focus, that cursor snaps to green and tells you you are dead on. So if you're shooting 4K or 6K with an HD viewfinder, you're not slave to the limited resolution of that viewfinder. This tells you you got it. Okay, which existing lens mounts are sufficient? On this new camera, for the first time for Canon, we let the end user choose the mount. We haven't graduated to LPL yet, but we do let you go EF Cinema, which has a lock on it, or PL. And it's 4 screws. With each of these adapters, there's a shim set and lots of instructions, and you can change. The user can change this. We think this is important. We certainly got slapped around the head to consider it. Now, which cameras can window down, David asks, another question, to different lenses? Well, we start out and say the full-frame sensor can accept the full-frame lenses, zooms and primes, not only ours, but many others that you heard about tonight. Or you can put a super 35 millimeter on, and of course it'll put in the smaller image circle. You just go to the menu and say, I put a super 35 on, I want 4K, and it then will read out 4K. And you can say, by the way, I want 4K DCI or 4K UHD. You can put a super 16 millimeter lens on, and you can ask the readout to give you 2K DCI or 1920 1080p HD. Or if you want a long zoom, you can put a broadcast 2/3 inch lens on with a little adapter that we make that takes you from B4 11 millimeter to the 16 millimeter or whatever it is that the Super 16 is diagonal, and you lose about a stop in light, and you recreate again a 2K DCI or a UHD, HD. So that's your choices, and these are the formats that you generate. I'm showing the DCI in every case. Depending on the lens that you put on, these are the dimensions and the readouts that you get. You can switch to 4K UHD or HD. And David further asked, okay, if you can do all that, what about anamorphic? So very quickly, here's a scene. We're going to do a 2:3:9. We'd like to see this on the screen, ultimately. And now we got a lot of choices. We'll start with probably one of the most popular, the 2:1 squeeze anamorphic. So if I do that, and I want 2:3:9, and I want 2:3:9 precisely, I don't want to do any messing around in post-production. I would just want to unsqueeze 2:1 and get my 2:3:9. To do that, you must squeeze to a 1.195 on the image sensor, and there are frame lines in the viewfinder that pop that up and say, here's what you do. You just adjust for that. And now the pixel count you get would be 3752 by 3100, more than 10 megapixels for that squeeze. Now, that's a very tight squeeze. Not everybody likes that, but some do. The more popular one we hear is, I want my 2:3:9, but I want a little latitude in post to be able to move around a little bit and play, and I'll do a little bit of cropping. The 2:6:6, that's very popular with the 2:1 squeeze. If you do that, you get a perfect 4:3 projection onto the image sensor, and with that, this is the pixel count. 4K, more than 4K by more than 3K, 12 plus megapixels for that anamorphic. Now, anamorphics, my good friend Les came out with 1.8. Now, he did that for his own reasons, and when we looked at it, we said, you know what, we like that, because if I put a 1.8 on our image sensor, it'll project at a precise 4:3, which a lot of people love, and that takes the 1.8 compression. And again, you get your more than 12 megapixels for the anamorphic. Now, there are anamorphics and there are anamorphics. There's 1.3 anamorphics. If you do that, it fits beautifully into our, because we got 5952 pixels, and the 5776 fits perfectly. There are 1.5 anamorphics. If you put them on, you get 5000, which again fits in. So pretty well, all of the anamorphics out there will sit beautifully on our image sensor. Okay, now I'm going to talk about some additional technologies. I'm going to watch my time. High-speed readout. We do not have global shutter in this image sensor. We have rolling shutter. But we do a high-speed readout of the image sensor. If you're shooting 24 frames, we read out at 60 frames per second. And then in the frame memory, we reconstruct the 24. So if you pan the camera, that skew that you get with the rolling shutter would be reduced by 2.5 times. And the feedback we've been getting, we have this in our earlier CinemaEOS cameras, an awful lot of people say, you know, this is good enough. There are the purists who say, I want no skew. Well, go global shutter. But people do seem to like this. And this is the readout mechanism, 24 down to the 16 milliseconds, frame memory back. If you capture 60 frames per second, we'll read out at 120 frames per second and give you a 2-to-1 reduction in that skew. It's one of those things you have to see for yourself. It's very subjective. And now the other one, this is important. This is built into the image sensor. Debayering. We all have this single sensor with the bare mask on it. And what we do is we debayer in the readout. We read out 4 wires come out, not 1 wire. 4 wires come out. In the readout, we break down the bare to red, blue, and 2 greens. And we have perfect reconstruction of your RGB, except there's a resolution difference between the greens, the reds, and the blues. But there are no algorithmic reconstruction errors by this method. This is very big if you're going into very extreme, high-resolution, fine detail. We then do interpolation and take you up to RGB 6K. Then we do some processing in there, one of which I'll talk about in a moment, diffraction correction. And then we downsample and filter to make your 4K RGB. And that becomes then you choose DCI 4K or UHD 4K. Now, the beauty about this processing is this is native 4K, where you have that aliasing there because of that sideband. You oversample, you've moved the sideband way out. Now you've got latitude, and you've got a higher depth of modulation here. You've got latitude to put a filter in and get that sideband away, and then do a 4K and get this much more MTF into your 4K. So you, from the super sampling, you get a higher MTF 4K, lower aliasing, and a noise averaging that makes the noise look a little better. Multiple ISO, very popular today. A lot of the cameras have the dual ISO, and it works beautifully. We like to introduce it to quintuplets rather than twins. What we do is in our readout, we have at a very strategic point on all the multiple columns of readout an analog amplifier. And it's placed between the noise that's in the image sensor and then noises that you encounter as you're reading out, the sample and hold, the thermal noise of the output amplifier, and the quantizing. As you're losing light and you're cranking up ISO, these guys are getting you. So what we do is we have that analog amplifier very strategically placed, and as we crank up the ISO, we give you 5 steps in an analog gain. I'll show you that here. This is where you're at the base of, you have a gain of 0.5 at ISO 800, and as you then crank up the ISOs to 1600, you go gain of 1, gain of 2, gain of 4, gain of 8. And the noise floor, which starts out at 11 electrons, when you're at 800, actually drops. The total noise drops to 2.2 electrons. And the final result, these little diamonds, are the steps in gain. And you can see we are keeping that noise way down all the way to 1200 ISO. After that, we give up. We let the digital gain control take over. And the consequence of that is the luma noise stays pretty constant. And then at ISO 3200, you've lost a dB, you lose another dB, and then you start to lose your dBs. But you have pretty beautiful control of signal to noise and dynamic range certainly up to the 12,800 ISO. And this is showing you where the gain steps are, that analog gain that's built into the image sensor. Okay, 2 additional new imaging system features. Diffraction correction. You're probably aware that in our high-end photographic cameras, we have diffraction correction. We've had it, something that our scientists have been working on for a decade, and it gets better and better with each generation. Finally, we said, you guys seem to have got something that we need over on the motion imaging side. And I think we may be the first cinema camera to put diffraction correction. So diffraction is an optical phenomenon. The first thing that gets you, of course, is the lens, then the optical low-pass filter. So the optical low-pass filter might look like something like that, and that would do something like that to your camera if you had a perfect lens, a diffraction-limited lens only. But no lens is like that. All lenses are like that. That applies to everybody's lens. Diffraction. It's an immutable guy that will not go away, and it haunts you as you stop down. And of course, what the optical people and what our folks did, our scientists did, was they looked at diffraction, and they look at it as the point spread function. If you put a tiny pinpoint of light through the lens, through the optical filter onto the image sensor, it gets spread like that. And then as you stop down, and those curves start to grab you, it starts to spread like that. So 2 line pairs at some point start to blur. That's the diffraction phenomenon. So here it is shown here with the increasing, if you will, point spread function getting bigger and bigger as you stop down. This is the effect it has. This is the test chart. This is what the lens camera is reproducing. You've all seen it. Well, what we do is we report from the lens, we report aperture to a processing circuit that's in our rather complex processor in this camera that does this diffraction correction. Separately, we are reporting files that are in the lens that will do correction of chromatic aberration and peripheral illumination correction. But I'm talking now just about the diffraction. And here's what we do. And there's a lot of science behind this, a lot of stuff you'll doubt we'll ever publish a paper on it. But anyway, we do a conversion of point spread function and analyzing imaging coming in. Then we do a calculation in inverse function. And then the final algorithm that does the correction. Now, to give it, this is not image sharpening in the traditional sense. This is not image digital detail. This is not something that's adding edges. What it does is if I have a scene like this, and then I pick out a piece here, you can see that the textures in those trunks and those little fine branches have been sort of reduced. The texture has been reduced. When we put the diffraction correction on, the texture comes back with no artifacts. It's a mathematical process, and we think it's a first, and we're waiting to hear what people think about it. It's one of those things. But the idea is to allow you a little more latitude in your lens as you stop down and you start to be trapped by diffraction, that we'll alleviate that to a degree. The jury's out. It's the first camera, the one that's downstairs, we're dying to see. Last but not least, we put in multiple axis correction in the camera. And a great deal of that is analysis of what's on the image sensor. There are 5 axes, and you got 2 choices. If you have a lens, anybody's lens that has no image stabilization in it, and you mount it on the camera will do the 5 axes. If you have a lens, and there are quite a few lenses that have image stabilization, then and you couple it to this camera, the lens will do the pitch and yaw, and the body will do the X, Y, and the roll. And this just shows you a lens with no image stabilization. We have a gyro sensor inside the camera. Gyro sensor gives us measurements in 3 dimensions. And we then do a cutout in that large full frame. Now remember, we are normally oversampling the 5.9K down to 4K, and that's what's delivered, unless you're shooting raw. But this time we have to come in a little bit, so we will chew into your 4K resolution to a small degree, but we will give you the correction. If it's a roll where it tilts across, we do analysis of that, and then we do a correction electronically in software. And if it's a shift horizontally or a shift vertically, we do that correction and analysis. Whoops, have I lost? The angular is where we look for a change in perspective of the image. So we have to analyze the shape of the active image, and then we do a software correction to correct for the pitch and the yaw. If you have a lens that has image stabilization built into it, the lens will do the yaw and the pitch, and the camera does the rest. I hope I made 20 minutes. Thank you.
Hi. Good to meet you, David. Thank you. All right, let's see if I can get this. All right, where do I find the... Which one's mine?
Is it your birthday?
It is.
Hey, everyone. It's Graham's birthday tonight.
Thanks.
Happy birthday to you.
Thanks, David. Okay. So, are we gonna... How do we get it? Oh. So, my name's Graham Nattrass. I have been with Red since the very earliest of days when we had an idea to build a camera. And unfortunately, this slide is wrong. It says large format Graham Nattrass. I'm actually the normal size Graham Nattrass. The large format version must be somewhere else. So I thought I would deliver my perspective on large format, how it fits into the cameras, and also how Red has got to the large format sensor. So there's little bits of history thrown in here as well. and we'll see how it goes. So obviously, we started with the red one, and we moved on the body over to the DSMC1 with the Epic, and then at the moment we're on DSMC2 style bodies. Obviously downstairs we have the Ranger body. I'll talk a little bit about that. And we have gone through a whole range of different sensors. We have an active sensor team who are always working away, and I'm privileged to be able to speak to these guys and learn things about sensors and how they work. But I do image processing. I write image processing code and colorimetry that all runs inside all of the red cameras to generate the image that you see. As I say, I'm lucky enough to speak to the sensor guys, so hopefully some of that will rub off on tonight's presentation. That takes us up to today where we have the Monstro 8K VV-sized sensor. It's a large format sensor, and as our guy from Arri mentioned earlier, the Guardians of the Galaxy 2 shot on an earlier version of this. There's been two versions of the VV-size sensor. The first one was based as an extension of the Dragon sensor technology, and unfortunately, it was rather hard to build, and we couldn't build many of them and get the reliability of the process of actually building the sensors to where we wanted them to be so we could actually sell them. So we went back, and the Monstro is a completely different sensor. Although the pixel size and dimensions are the same, the sensor is very, very different. It comes in two bodies. So you've got the normal DSMC2 body, which is a very, very small, compact body. And I really like, this is what I would go out and shoot with, because if I'm shooting something, I'm just me on my own, and it's a very, very easy body to work with. You can actually go out and use it as an individual user. You don't have to be a whole film crew, although you can put lots of modules on to kit it out for all the needs that people want to use on a film or movie set. Interesting thing I was just pointed out to me just the other day on the size of the sensor. If you can't remember what the size of a Monstro sensor is, it's really easy, because it's actually just the DCI spec for 4K, 4096 by 2160. So it's pretty easy to remember. And it is obviously, therefore, the 1.9 aspect ratio. So you've got a DCI size sensor. It does come in the Ranger body, which is in the Monstro version for rental houses only. And that is a body kitted out, basically all of the modules that you would want to bolt onto a Red One. They all get sort of built into the body. It's a great body to work with, and Andrew was demonstrating that downstairs earlier. So let's look at where the sensors have grown from in size over time. I think one of the smallest ones we put out was the 4.5K Raven sensor, Dragon technology, and Scarlet W had a Dragon at 5K, a bit bigger still, and then we get out to 8K with the Helium. So I think we're actually slightly above Super 35 at this point. Then we get to Gemini, which is a little bit bigger still. The Gemini is actually quite interesting because you've got to remember this, 30.72 millimeters wide. We'll see why a little later. And then big jump up to the Monstro. And as I say, easy to remember the size because it is the DCI spec. There's drawing on the image circle, so you can see that the Helium has very good coverage for Super 35 millimeter lenses, although some of them can vignette a bit, so you've just got to be careful and check. Same on the Gemini, you've got to check to make sure they cover. And the VV image circle is pretty much exactly what the Monstro is. But why are we going to use these large format sensors? Well, my big thing is it's all about creative control. And creative control comes back to what everyone who's been speaking already says about lenses. It's actually nothing to do with the sensor. The sensor just has to be big enough to capture what that lens is giving you. It's all about the lenses. So it's really important that you choose the right lens. So if you have issues about depth of field and focus and everything, that's not the fault of the sensor. That is all down to the lens and how you choose it and what you're using. But from my point of view, is on the imaging side of things, what the large format gives me is very high resolution, low noise, and lens choice. So we're talking about large format. Well, everyone thinks shallow depth of field, so I'm going to show some shallow depth of field shots. That is a creative choice. It is not an inherent property of the large format. It's all about the lenses. And as you can see, you can really get easily a shot in a Tesla car. You can make something look very, very interesting with your large format lens choices. And the good thing is you can get large format lenses that cover the VV sensor from all of these vendors and probably more, which is brilliant. So there's a lot of choice out there. The Monstro large format sensor, you've got up to 60 frames a second at 8K, which is great. And because of the way that the red sensors work, as you window in, if you want to go down to a smaller area, that maximum frames per second is just going to go upwards. So if you want to have some good super 35mm lens compatibility, and I think this is really important because not everyone has their favorite lens is going to be on a large format size, and you don't want to be on set and have to swap a camera body as well as to get the lens compatibility. With the Monstro, you can pretty much just leave that on there and just swap the lenses, and if it happens to be a super 35mm lens, you're good, because if you do a 6K center crop out of the Monstro, it is exactly the same size width as what you would get on the Gemini. That also means you've got great compatibility with all of those super 35mm anamorphic lenses as well. And of course, as you crop down, the maximum frames per second on the sensor goes up. And I find that very useful if you want to record high-speed stuff and get into fun things with lasers. All of these lenses are going to give you at least 4K resolution on the Monstro. So there's fantastic compatibility out there. There's practically no lens that's not going to work very well. But again, why 8K? Who's got an 8K TV at home? I happen to have an 8K TV at home. I don't use it, but you know. Downsampling is really important, and what was said earlier about avoiding aliasing and being able to downsample, what it does to an image, and it's easy enough to illustrate here. You can see that you don't really want to ever be upsampling. It just never looks that good. Downsampling is the way to go, especially on a Bayer format sensor. You want to be able to capture natural, real detail, downsample it with good downsampling algorithms, and that's just going to boil down the richness of that image. It's like you're cooking a stock on the stove. As you boil it down, you're going to get more richness out of it. It means that that file's going to go through grading better. Now, people are going to say, well, hang on a sec, Graham. Back in 2006, you did a 4K Red 1, which was 4K resolution, and you said it was 4K resolution. Well, yes, that was the best we could do then. And although we were doing 4K for 4K, it made absolutely fantastic 2K and HD. Today, time has moved on, and if you want or need 8K, you can do 8K for 8K, and it looks really, really good. But if you take that 8K and boil it down to 4K, it looks even better still at 4K. And of course, the next thing, sensitivity. We talked about stopping down a lens if you're wanting to capture more depth of field. To me, it's important that the Monstro is actually a bit more sensitive than some of our other camera sensors, because we know that aids the creativity with the choice of lenses that you're going to use. So what's interesting is the Gemini is a dual ISO camera, so it's got a standard mode and a low light mode. And the Monstro is almost exactly one stop more sensitive than the Gemini in standard mode, which means it's almost exactly one stop less sensitive than the Gemini in low light mode. But what I did here is actually put on the size of the pixels, because the sensitivity isn't directly related to the size of the pixel on the sensor. It is about how that pixel is designed. Now, I'm not a sensor designer, so I can't tell you how that works. However, what I do is I have to measure this to make sure that when all the red cameras go out, no matter what sensor they're in, no matter what different optical low-pass filter is on them, when we say that they're all a particular ISO brightness, they all match up and measure exactly the same ISO brightness. So you're on set, you're cutting between them. You don't want to have to be then footsing them because of all that stuff. All that's handled in the calibration process. So the sensitivity comes from the design of the pixel, not necessarily the size of the pixel. And the extra sensitivity on the Monstro means that you've just got that greater range of flexibility on your lens choice, especially with aperture. And generally, I'd tell someone to start with Monstro at around ISO 800, but works very, very well at ISO 1600. And sometimes I get sent files from movies, and I can go into the metadata and see what they were shooting at. And I've seen stuff shot up to sort of ISO 6400, works very, very well, especially because you've got the 8K, especially because you can downsample to 4K or 2K, depending on the deliverable, and that just drops the noise floor every time you downsample. Now, the other thing with 8K is you want to minimize aliasing. Aliasing is horrible. When I was a kid, I remember watching the news on the TV, and you'd see the presenter's tie or shirt dancing in all those funny colors and patterns. And when I was 5-year-old, I have no idea what on earth that was called, but it was interesting. And the other thing is, I don't know if anyone's been to England, where I come from. As you're driving along the motorway, you sometimes see these motorway bridges, and they've got all of these sort of like, it's like a wire on them to form the barriers to stop people falling off. And as the car drives along, the back side of the bridge interferes with the front side of the bridge, and you get these wonderful aliasing moire patterns. And you know, Dad would be driving the car, I'd be sitting there, and I'd be looking out the window, and I'd seen this, like, I was like, whoa, this is fantastic. I had no idea what they were called or what they were, but I've sort of had this fascination with aliasing ever since. The thing is, of course, it's a fascination with something we absolutely do not want in our imaging systems, because it not only it looks ugly, these are computer-generated patterns rather than actual camera images. They look horrible, but even worse than looking horrible, if you get an aliasing pattern appearing on an object, be it someone's shirt or whatever, if the camera moves or the object moves, the aliases move in the opposite direction to the motion in the scene or what caused it. And of course, everything today goes out through distribution codecs that use motion vectors, and the motion vector sees this aliasing, and it says, well, the object's moving this way, and the aliasing's moving that way, and I don't know what to do. And of course, it can't have the redundancy. It's throwing bits at it to waste, which could have been much better storing actual natural imagery and real detail that we want to see in the scene. So we just really don't want aliasing there for umpteen different reasons. So rather than say the cameras then the resolution lead to a very, very low aliasing image, because you can never really get rid of it completely, because optical low-pass filters are quite slow. And it's not like in audio where you can have brick wall anti-alias filters and practically guarantee you'll never have any aliasing distortion. In cameras, we can't really do that. We have to make sensible compromises. And a sensible compromise, I say, is I don't ever want to see aliasing on a real-world scene. But if someone can provoke a camera to alias on a test chart, okay, fair enough. And I think that works very, very well in practice. But even still on a test chart, this is a 2K zone. You have no aliasing, and you have incredibly good MTF right to the edge. So you know if you're taking the 8K image down to 2K, you've got fantastic contrast and no aliasing. And same at 4K. Again, this is the 4K zone on the chart, and I've had to show a really enlarged crop, because if I try to put a whole 8K image on here, even with a 4K projector, you're going to see aliasing because of the projection and everything else that isn't actually in the camera data that was captured. So again, with 4K, you have very, very low aliasing. You have really good MTF all the way out to 4K and beyond, keeps going beyond that. And that means that when you take that 8K image and say you've got a 4K or 2K deliverable, you do a proper downsample in post where you can have, you know, proper good low-pass filtering before you downsample. You boil all of that image down into the 4K or 2K, you get very, very low noise, very, very low aliasing, and everyone is happy. Of course, 8K, big files, very big files. People complain. It's not just the files that you have to capture on camera. It's not just the files that you're going to go into your media. It's your offloading. It's your backups. All of that just slows everything down. And as you can see, if we were recording fully uncompressed RAW, the files are either big, or if we record RGB, enormous. Even a good quality codec like Apple's ProRes is going to make really, really big files, and no one wants them. And what do? Well, we have Red Code RAW, and that is a RAW codec in that it keeps everything in the Bayer pattern that was captured at the sensor level. It doesn't demosaic it, but it does compress it, and it compresses it very, very tastefully so that you can extract all of that goodness out. You're not throwing away the resolution. You're not ruining all that stuff I was saying with aliasing and downsampling. And I thought for historical sake, would bring up an original compact flash card that we would have used on the Red one, if people can remember back then. And the interesting bit is, of course, you've got about 10 minutes of 4K on one of those cards. And of course, now we have solid-state drives and mini-mags, and this slide is in a really funny order. And you get about 1.5 hours of 8K RAW on one of them at a compression ratio which is more than acceptable for Netflix, for instance. Now, if we could record and compress, if that card had the data rate to get that, you still get your 10 minutes, which I thought was quite funny because it's what we would have got on the original Red compact flash card. Now, it's a large format sensor, but it is still a small camera. So I took this image in a nickel mine on Sudbury, Ontario, at the big nickel museum that they have there. And it was great because the camera is compact, but the sensor is large, so I can get some really, really interesting images in very, very low light, damp, horrible circumstances, and I can carry the camera with me and do that. If the camera was larger, bulkier, bigger, I wouldn't have been able to do that on my own, especially with my, I think at the time, 5-year-old lad holding my hand all the way through, and I'm trying to hold the camera with the other hand. So again, down in the mine. So I think it's very, very important. It's not just the sensor, it's the camera and the package and what you can get out of it. And of course, what it means is we can enable stories, because if it wasn't people telling stories with our cameras, none of us would be here. If it was just a technological tool, you know, we wouldn't be caring about any of this. Large format, lenses, image quality, low aliasing, none of that would matter. But because we're telling stories, we need to bring people into our stories. We don't want noise, artifacts, but we do want creative control. We want creative use of depth of field, and that doesn't always mean shallow depth of field. It could mean wide depth of field. It could mean wide vistas, the very wide views that we get with IMAX movies. And of course, none of that matters at all if the camera is not practical and we can't record the RAW for the flexibility to change all of that and edit it in post, always referencing back to that RAW data. And that's what the Red Code enables with the compression. So technology enables stories. Thanks.
Hi.
And at the end, if you all want to stick around for about 5 minutes, we'll do a quick Q&A, if anyone has any questions.
So I'm just going to I did some updates. Do you mind if I just switch it real quick? I just airdropped it right there. I can just accept it. Yeah. It's going to be Yep, I will, absolutely. I can just open it, and then I'll just go. Thanks, yeah, I figured I would do it quick. Yeah, no problem. Boom. All right, that's me. So I'm Mike Bubalo. I'm a little different from the rest of the speakers, some legends on the stage today. I've been in the industry now for almost 20 years. I got my MFA in photography. So I'm coming from a different perspective as well because I came from the professional still side and not so much the professional video side. So this is a little unique for me. So hopefully I give a little bit of a different perspective. I'm not going to get as technical as some of the presentations today because I just changed everything in the back as we were discussing because we did all the technical stuff already. So maybe I'll give a little bit of a different spin today. I started my manufacturer career at Sony, and I was on the development and engineering team at Lake Success, back when they were at Lake Success, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I managed the pro support team throughout the country and the training and technical team throughout the US for all products from the consumer products, from Alpha up to the FX9, and even dabble a little bit in the Venice series cameras as well. So when it comes to video cameras and when it comes to what we were talking about before, what Red was talking about is that talking about the content and the creation of film and art. And we can really dissect the users into two different places. I like to say there's the takers and then there's the makers. There's getting the acquisition, being the somewhat photojournalist, capturing sports, and just getting the content where connectivity is king. And then you also have the artists that are creating cinema, that are creating movies, that are really looking for something that's stylistic and creative. And when you break down those categories, sensor size comes into play. So when you look at like the ENG cameras, whether it's the low budget ENG cameras or the high budget ENG cameras, you tend to want to use a smaller sensor because you can't think about focus. Time is of the essence. You want everything in focus, and you also need to be able to move that data very fast. You want to be able to move that data live while you're streaming. You want to be able to move high resolution, high data, but need to be able to use a smaller sensor. And of course, once you get more to the creative side, in the cinema world, we've always wanted to have bigger and better surface area. And that's why IMAX film has always been big film. Super 35 has always been very large. And then now we're starting to get into the digital SLRs, where I think full frame has really come to fruition. And we'll get into a little bit of the history of that. They just kind of break down sensor sizes. I know we went through it a lot today, so I won't get too much into it. But when we looked at Super 35 back with film, it's much smaller than when we talk about full frame. And you can see when you see the visual representation of it, it's 2 times the size of Super 35. And it gives us a lot of advantages, and we'll kind of go over some of those advantages in a little bit. But I always think it's funny to go over, we always see people shooting with their iPhones, like a lot of us doing right now. And especially with the new iPhones, where we're seeing a huge campaign in terms of Apple saying that you can shoot movies, you can shoot short films with iPhones. You can go on Vimeo right now and actually see thousands and thousands of people shooting with iPhones and shooting short films, and it's pretty incredible. And there's lots of disadvantages, obviously. There's almost all disadvantages to it, except for portability. But when you talk about a full-frame sensor, we're talking about a sensor that's 40 times the size. And there's just nothing that you're going to be able to do to ever compete in that space. But when we had a couple of quotes from people from Panavision. Full frame is just going to become the de facto format. Just like Super 35 became the de facto format, full frame is now the de facto format, because as sensor technology grows and sensor technology gets better, it's getting now, the sensor technology grew and and everything became tremendous in terms of Super 35, and all that technology starts on a small scale. And you'll see some of the sensor technology that we've created in the future in a couple of slides. But we've created technology from the ground up, from small sensors all the way up to large sensors. And you see technology be born on sensors made for cell phones, on sensors made for 1 inch. Then we bring it to 2, then we bring it to APS-C, and then it's available for full frame. And we're able to see that technology grow. And now that the technology's here with full frame, you're able to do things now with full frame that you've been able to do with Super 35. And we really do think it's the de facto format. Until, of course, 10 years from now when we're talking about medium format video, but that's besides the point. So obviously, we've gone through it today. Depth of field, shallow depth of field, being able to get that shallow depth of field is one of the main reasons why people want to do large format. Because we're able to get good high ISO in Super 35, we're able to get good reproduction and good detail and good resolution in Super 35, but shallow depth of field is something that you just can't do in Super 35 as much as you can do in full frame, especially when you have lenses that go down to, 1.95, because there's a lot of adaptability. There's a lot that you can do on that full frame sensor, and you can adapt almost anything. Of course, with full frame, we've talked about the advantages, over 15 stops dynamic range on our cameras. You're going to be able to get extreme color space, amazing low light, faster shutter speeds, S-Log3 giving you 15 stops dynamic range. And when we talk about S-Log3, it's not just in our higher end cameras. S-Log3 comes from the consumer cameras all the way up. So we have S-Log3 on a camera that costs $800 on a Super 35 sensor. And we have S-Log3 that goes, that's even on our FX9 and Cine Gamma 3, giving us color space that's tremendous. And of course, I like to say it's aspect ratio agnostic, because the larger the sensor, we can crop it however we want. And we've gone through aspect ratios all day long, so I'm not going to really stress too much on it. But when it comes to high ISO performance, I remember introducing the A7S to the world at the press conference. Mark was there. So it actually wasn't originally produced as a video camera. It was produced as a stills camera that was great in low light. We can go up to 409,600 ISO, being able to give the creator options to be able to do whatever they want. They can go in complete darkness and be able to shoot whatever they want. If you can't see your hand, normally you wouldn't be able to even think about or conceive about taking a picture. Obviously, that's an extreme example, but the camera's being able to see where you can't see and has better vision than the human eye, and we're able to get results that are just pretty phenomenal. Unfortunately, my pictures got a little crunched, but still, the high ISO performance on these sensors are just absolutely phenomenal. And you're going to be able to get high ISO performance at 25,600, 50,000, that's completely usable in a video setting. And of course, we talked about low light. Let's talk about too much light. So the FX9 is the world's first and still only electronically controlled ND filter built into the camera up to 128th of a stop. So it's pretty amazing that you're going to be able to do this all within the camera. Some of the sensor tech that Sony uses, I'm not going too much into the cameras and what we can do, but one of the big things that we introduced a long time ago was backside illuminated sensors. And what we do with that backside illuminated sensors, it seems obvious that we would do this, that everyone would do this, but normally the copper wiring and the photodiodes, usually the photodiodes are underneath the copper wiring, so light would have to go through that copper wiring to be able to get down to the photodiodes in the light sensitive area of the sensor. So what we did was we just reversed the structure, and now we put the light sensitive area on the top, which as soon as you really start going, and when we first introduced this and I started to think about it and I started to hear it and listening to the engineers, I was like, why the hell did we do it any other way? Like, this doesn't make any sense. But we're able to get almost double the pixel area as we had before. We've introduced gapless sensor technology, gapless lens structure technology, because that too has not been implemented. Usually the wiring would run in between the photodiodes and the photo lenses. So now not only did we introduce backside illuminated, but we also introduced gapless lens technology. Now something that isn't on any of our higher end video cameras, but is in our A9 and A9 Mark II, which is our flagship stills camera, we introduced XMR RS. We're all familiar with global shutters, but with XMR RS, we actually make integral memory built into the sensor itself. So it's able to scan the sensor 100 times faster than any other sensor in the world. So you're going to be able to get you're going to be able to move information. You're going to be able to have the refresh rate of the sensor be extremely fast and be able to do things that no other sensor is capable of doing at this point. And I'm sure we're going to be able to see this technology move into some of our higher end cameras in the future. Of course, when it comes to Sony cameras, we've had a long heritage, a long history. Then in 2008, the F35 became our first Super 35 camera. I feel like that's forever ago. I've been at Sony since 2008 at the introduction of the F35, and I was just blown away by it. It was the first product on the professional video side that I had the pleasure of working with. and it just blew me away. And here we are 10 years later talking about full-frame camcorders, which is pretty amazing. And of course, thousands and thousands of productions have been made with Cine Alta cameras. One thing I kind of wanted to take a step back and go back to full-frame cameras and kind of go over the history of where 35mm full-frame cameras started from. And it comes from the consumer side a little bit, because the 5D Mark II, which was my pride and joy at the time, which pains me to say it now, but when I was working at Canon, I was on the engineering team with the 5D Mark II. And I remember when we first got our samples in the country, the 5D Mark II, originally about 7 months before the cameras got launched, weren't doing video. And they told us that they might be doing video. They were on the fence about it. So we worked with the team in Japan and became the first full-frame camera to be able to do video, which was pretty impressive. I remember handing off the camera to Vincent Laforet to shoot Reverie, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, on a Friday, and he gave us a completed video on Monday morning. It was just absolutely spectacular, and it kind of took the world by storm, because full-frame video just didn't exist at the time, and it really kind of changed everything. And not only did it change everything in terms of the size of the sensor, but it changed everything in the terms of how many lenses can be adapted to it, and the fact that everyone now can afford to use a video camera and can be able to shoot full frame. And of course, Canon also needed to give a little bit of props to the D90, because the D90 was the first SLR to be able to shoot the video ever. And it shot Super 35 APS-C back in 2008 at the same time as the F-35. So that too was impressive. The industry was very, very fertile at this point. And to just give a little bit of tidbit, in 2005, Canon came out with the 5D, which was the first affordable full-frame camera. So in just a few short years, we had video. And of course, A7S, A7S II, I think revolutionized the industry in terms of the consumers and bringing full frame for everybody. And we've really seen a huge acceptance of it, and I think it's really changed the industry, and I think it's one of the reasons why the industry has kind of adopted the full frame as much as it has. Because at the A7S, at $3,000, gave you 4K, gave you full frame, no line skipping, no pixel binning, full pixel readout, so you're able to get image quality that rivaled that of our Cine Alta partners, brethren, and they weren't, when we talked to those guys, they weren't too happy about it. Paul can probably attest to that. But of course, high ISO, extreme high ISO, S-Log2, Cine Gamma 2, full pixel readout. And then when the A7S II came out, it changed everything kind of once again, even though it was only 1 year later that we came out with it, because now we have in-body stabilization. We can do 4K internal. And it just changed the way we did things. And right as soon as the A7S Mark II came out, we started making feature films, or people started making feature films with the A7S II, which is inconceivable when you talk about the cameras that are in existence today. All the cameras we talked about today, people were picking up the A7S II to shoot with. Why the heck would you pick up an A7S II to shoot a feature film? Because you can keep your budgets low, or if you have a low budget for a film, you can keep your budgets low. You can shoot a $500,000 production, a $200,000 production, and be able to make a feature film with a cinematic look, and be able to get something that's really small, that's really compact, and not really have to worry about the camera as much as you would, your $5,000 a day rental budget. One of the things that kind of changed and adapted and allowed people to, filmographers and creators, to shoot with the A7S II and the A7S to be able to shoot, is that anamorphic lenses weren't full frame. There were no anamorphic full frame lenses at the time. So Screen Gems worked with Hawk and Vantage, and they came up with a line of lenses, anamorphic lenses that worked and covered the entire full frame sensor. So they had about, at the time, with Cadaver, or the possession of Hannah Grace, there's only 2 sets of these lenses in the world and about 8 lenses. And they used one of those sets of lenses on this. Glenn Gaynor has been one of the producers and executive producers, and he's the president of physical production at Screen Gems. And I like what he says, because not only is the A7S II right for his studio production, but it helps democratize storytelling around the world, because it's a powerful camera accessible to people who may not otherwise be empowered to tell their story. What that means is that you're going to be able to get the creativity, and you're going to be able to get that shallow depth of field, that high ISO, that color reproduction in a camera that can fit in your pocket, in a camera that costs $3,000, and you're able to get images and you're able to get film that looks cinematic, and to most consumers can't tell the difference. Obviously, the image quality on the Alexa is going to be better than an A7S, and that's not the point of this conversation. The point is bringing this type of quality to everybody. So, and these are some of the quotes from Leonard Hillard. And he brings up good points. Obviously, the cameras, one of the biggest challenges is working with the 8-bit. And 8-bit today is different than 8-bit before. 8-bit on the A7S gives you 15 plus stops dynamic range, and it's able to do things that you normally couldn't do with an 8-bit camera. So it changes the definition of 8-bit. But that being said, it's still limited to 8-bit, and it still gave some limitations to filmmakers. But you were still able to get beautiful, monumental images with it. Dynamic range, color science, skin tone, detailed blacks, natural highlight. All these things are just phenomenal in that image quality, and it just brings a different kind of aspect to the filmographer, to the person. What they did on this set, actually, and to kind of bring that whole point of affordability, in a sense, is that they had 3 cameras and 3 lenses all outfitted. So not only does it save you money, of course, in the terms of the cameras itself, because the hardware is really never that huge of an expense, but it saves you in terms of time, which is the biggest cost on any production, because you're able to just swap out the camera and the lens in one unit, and to be able to move on and be able to change angles, to be able to change field of view, etc. You're able to put it on the window of a car. You're able to go into spaces that you normally couldn't go, and you're able to do things that you normally couldn't do. And of course, there's already been about, I think, 11 feature films shot with the A7S and Alpha series cameras. These are just 4 of the options, 4 of the productions that I'm highlighting here. But if you pick them up, look at them, and you can really see the cinematic view and the depth of field and the shallow depth of field on movies that cost less than $2-3 million in production, instead of talking about movies like Guardians of the Galaxy that are billion-dollar productions. So this really kind of allows producers and directors to be able to expand their vision, to be able to do things that they normally couldn't do.
Do you want to make it clear that all 3 of these are large format cameras?
Yep, exactly. So when it comes to Sony, we're the largest sensor manufacturer in the world. We're the first ones, obviously, to utilize full frame in terms of 4K video acquisition. First ones to be able to do electronic neutral density filters. But the Venice, the FX9, and the Alpha series cameras, the full frame Alpha series cameras, are all full frame sensors. They're all capable of doing extremely high-end video production out of these 3 cameras. So Sony as a company is essentially, on their higher end, Cine Alta line and Alpha line are all full frame. We have about 14 full frame cameras at this point. And without cameras, and obviously the Venice, Paul can speak to the Venice a little bit more than I can even after this, so feel free to pick our brains afterwards, but we're all familiar with the Venice. There's been over 120, the slide's a little old now, so now there's, I think, about 140 theatrical, broadcast, cable, and streaming productions already produced with the Venice, and it's only about 1.5 years old. I know autofocus is a little bit of a taboo subject here, so I figured since I'm going last, you can boo me at the end. But when it comes to autofocus, we talked about the limitations of full frame and the shallow depth of field of autofocus. And one thing that Sony kind of prides ourselves on is just pushing the bar and doing things that no one's done before. And things that we can do, again, that we perfect on the consumer side and then bring to the professional side, is that we're able to do autofocus like nobody else can do. We're able to do autofocus and have pupil autofocus on subjects moving up to 50 miles an hour at the camera. And that's in video and in stills. So imagine never having to do autofocus again. I'm sorry to all you focus prolers out there, but it really kind of is where we feel things are going, because you're able to do things that you've never thought you'd be able to do before. I'm able to shoot professional sports and be able to focus on the pupil of an eye on just one subject. I'm able to find, well, Yeah, I mean, I shot the Final Four last year, and I was able to do Zion during the tournament and be able to get just his eyeball and memorize just his face to make sure I just want his eye. And I was able to track his pupil everywhere around the court in video and in still, and it was pretty phenomenal. It does things that you just never thought possible before. And sometimes when companies like Sony give you something like this, you never thought things were possible, and now you can think of it. And now I always beg people to just try it out. If you don't like it, there's always manual focus. And I did want to brings up lenses as well, because one of the reasons why autofocus isn't prevalent is because the lenses aren't capable of doing it. And now with Sony, we're relatively new in terms of our mirrorless cameras. We only started in 2014 in making full-frame mirrorless cameras, and since then we've come out with 35 full-frame lenses in that short amount of time. And every single one of these lenses and every single one of these 55 lenses were all produced for stills and for video at the same exact time. And when I say that they're produced for stills and for video, the autofocus motors, the iris control, everything is designed to be just as well adapted for still photographers as it is for video photographers. So it kind of melds that gap, and it kind of mends that gap, because as we all know, when you use traditional SLR lenses, they're not good for video. They have focus breathing, they're not parafocal, they're very noisy, their iris control is not stepless. It just isn't designed for video, and that's just not what they're designed to do, where every single one of our 55 lenses are designed for video and for stills. And one thing that I wanted to kind of bring up is that our G Master line of lenses brings optics to a whole new level, because every single one of our full-frame lenses is capable of resolutions 150 plus megapixels. So we're designing everything for the future. We're designing things when we first started, when the cameras didn't even do video, to be able to do video acquisition, because we're always looking a decade ahead from where we're at. And what's important about G Master lenses is because normally when you look at lenses, you can either choose one thing or the other. You can either choose sharpness or you can choose beautiful bokeh. And what G Master is able to do, we created a $1 billion lens manufacturing plant just for this, is that we're able to get extreme sharpness and extremely distortion free, and we're able to get beautiful bokeh. And we'll get into some of those examples in a second, because we're now operating at 50 line pairs per millimeter, whereas normal cameras and normal things are about 10 lines per millimeter. So we're going to get extreme accuracy. And you'll see here where the conventional spherical lenses that are done by hand are very uneven, because they're done by hand. And it seems almost blasphemous again to say that we have molds and we have machines making some of our lens elements to be able to give us perfect images. Unfortunately, surgeons aren't as accurate as robots in a lot of ways. And that's, of course, working on a human being. I'm just talking about a lens element. So it seems natural that we would want automation to be able to make the absolute perfect lens element, to be able to give us absolutely perfect bokeh with no onion ring, perfectly circular, and to make sure that we also have extreme sharpness from corner to corner. And our edges will have soft edges as opposed to hard edges on your bokeh. It's funny when you talk to some people and you say, "Oh, that bokeh is real sharp," and they don't understand what you're saying until you actually see really good bokeh. Because when you look at Leica glass back in the day, the bokeh was gorgeous, but yet the Zeiss was sharper. Now you can kind of get both of those together. And one of the things that we are able to do is that instead of using traditional SSM ring motors, and unfortunately I don't have the slide for this, where you have two giant coils moving the largest lens element or one of the largest lens elements, that requires a lot of power, that requires a lot of noise, and it's not accurate. Because if we're just focusing on the pupil of the eye, we need something to be accurate, fast, and silent. So what we did was we created all direct drive supersonic motors. Essentially, it's a magnet and a rail where you're moving the smallest lens element. So we're able to move that element 20,000 times per second to be able to get perfectly fine focus that's completely silent, very fast, and very accurate. Things that you just can't do with traditional lenses. And that's why autofocus can do the things that we can do, but you need a lens to be able to do it. Of course, with some of the lenses, all of our lenses, like I said, they're designed for video. Focus breathing is always a huge issue, and that's one of the main reasons why people always went to cinema lenses, because focus breathing on a traditional SLR lens is poor and unacceptable. But when you look at, when you're doing focus breathing on lenses that are designed for video, and granted, this is also a zoom lens, so it's a 28 to 135 that covers the entire full frame sensor, your focus breathing is almost non-existent. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Oh. Axial displacement. Again, this is another one because as you, and this is only for zoom lenses, but as you zoom in with traditional SLR lenses, your center axis will shift. But our lenses have no axial displacement whatsoever. So where you start at the wide end, you're going to end up on the telephoto end. And that also brings me to the point that they're also parfocal, because, or as close to parfocal as possible. You always have the naysayers like, you are 1/1,000,000th of a millimeter off. Understood. I understand. I'm not, there's a reason why there's $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $300,000 lenses, and we're talking about $1,200 to $2,000 lenses here. But again, bringing these technologies to the masses, being able to do things that you normally couldn't do, and being able to get results that you just normally couldn't get. So I know I'm kind of diverting from what we've talked about today in terms of extreme high end, and I'm kind of bringing it down to a grassroots level. But I think it's important to understand where some of these technologies come from, and I think where the technology is going. So. And of course, stepless iris control, something as simple as stepless iris control, where traditional SLR lenses can't be moved without seeing shifts, extreme shifts in terms of moving your stops of light, where our lenses are all completely stepless, where you can move your iris seamlessly. So you can do this while filming, of course, and be able to get a unique perspective that you normally wouldn't ever be able to do. So I know I'm talking a lot about lenses, but I think it's important to realize that with the E-mount, it's a mount that works across all of our cameras, and it's a mount that can adapt any lens that's ever been produced, essentially, to the system. I think we tried to come up with the number of lenses that are adaptable to the E-mount system, which is the E-mount system that you can use on the Venice, FX9, and all the Alpha series cameras, and I believe it's about 45,000 different combinations that you can have on the camera itself. There's adapters for everything, but of course the Sony lenses and the Sony lens technology allows you to do the autofocus and the video results on a lens that is affordable, a lens that can be used in cinematic production, lenses that are fast, and lenses that can be able to do things that you normally wouldn't be able to do. And that's all I have. So hopefully it wasn't too bad.
While we're setting up, I just want to amplify one or two things Mike just said. Because basically you're saying that Sony lenses are using high-resolution electronic drive to move elements instead of mechanical cams, which is how cine lenses have traditionally been made.
Yep.
So you're not mechanically driving the focus, you're not mechanically driving the zoom elements. You're doing it through electronic linear drive motors. Exactly, very high resolution, which allows you to computerize.
Correct,
And
and we're
those things
perfecting
throw
how,
algorithms at them.
exactly, and focus by wire is another taboo term essentially that everyone thinks of. But focus by wire now has been slowly perfected, we've been slowly perfecting it as much as we possibly can, and be able to make it tactile, be able to make it measurable, and be able to make it repeatable. And those are things that normally stop people from using focus by wire, but it also allows us to get all the benefits of focus by wire at the same time. So it's really a huge step, I think, in terms of production.
By the way, is Larry still around? Is Graham still around?
Yep.
Everyone come on up.
I saw Larry.
And Gunter. And one other thing I want to say is that in your FX9 camera, it's not just simple autofocus. You're not only doing eye recognition, you're doing face recognition, shape recognition, and pattern recognition. And if the camera recognizes a person and someone passes between you and that subject, it will not jump to the person passing in front of you. It will remain on the person in the back because it has intelligence built into it. And that's pretty advanced. That came out of your still camera line. And it's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary advance, whether you have a taste for autofocus or not.
It's soon we'll have the same autofocus performance with the autofocus for animals as well, for all your wildlife.
Anyone seen Larry Thorpe?
Larry ran out with his bag, so.
What's that?
I think he walked right out.
Okay. He took a long flight to get here, so if he left, I understand. Yeah. Oh, sure. Hey, Jeff?
Oh.
You want to come up here?
That's why.
Do we have any questions? Anyone burning with a question to ask any of these gentlemen? Are you so overwhelmed with information? Yes. In the back.
I joined SMPTE 34 years ago, and it seems like the technology really hasn't changed. We're using square or rectangular sensors in a round hole. Is there any thought of turning that around and making the sensors round or spherical in a round hole?
Yes. I mean, if it's up to me, we always, at Sony and at Canon, my job is really to try to develop future products, and one of the presentations that I've made with my teams at both companies is that exact sentiment, round sensors, because then you're orientation agnostic. You can get 33% more image area. It would just be great. Or even a square sensor would also give us the same effect, but round sensor, square sensor, because we're cutting it on the diode on the piece of silicone anyway. But I've been met with deaf ears many times, so we'll see. But it's something that's definitely been discussed, at least at Canon and Sony.
Okay, my question is real simple. Does it speed up or slow down production when you shoot with a larger sensor, and also does it cost more? So who can answer that?
I mean, if you're talking about speeding up production, large format shooting is probably harder than Super 35. And I think, especially when you're shooting a TV show, where people are just running, going all day, on and on, you will probably run into the issue where a shot is not in focus because you may have wanting to shoot shallow or depth of field. You know, so it's like a cost-benefit thing. Is visually you can make a show look different, but yes, it comes at this. It's kind of a learning curve that you have to kind of take into the account. Okay, am I going to shoot wide open with every lens here? But then, yeah, we'll have to take after take because sometimes you just don't have it. So from the point of, I think the expense of post, yes, there's more data, but it's insignificantly more. So there's no difference there compared to the old analog film where it was super expensive to shoot 65mm film or 35mm film.
I mean, I think it would come down to intent. When you come to the process with intent going into it, you have a much more favorable result and a much better outcome. People who use the format with an intent to shallow out the background, to separate the subject, or to isolate them, they have more favorable outcomes because they're going into the format with a reason that motivates its use and application. Right now I'm on a show with multiple Venices, and we're mixing spherical and anamorphic back and forth with a really nice result to be able to get a little more grittiness out of an anamorphic lens and sharpen up and use spherical when we want to go in for more intimate work.
That brings up another question. Do you guys know of anybody, because you can window down to different sizes, these are CMOS sensors, are people windowing down to get a more narrow angle of view?
We're going the other way, actually.
Okay.
On a recent show I did called Instinct, we had DXL2s, and we would do primarily 6K HD Super 35 with a 40-ish 38mm image circle, and we'd go to 8K full frame and really isolate the subject for motivations. It was our protagonist's intent to psychoanalyze his murder subjects. So that motivated us to go to 8K, use anamorphic options with Kish optics for full frame on Primo 70s. Really, if there's a motivation, there's so much room to play, and this is a wonderful canvas to play with. But if there's not a motivation or a reason, then you might find yourself struggling more to find the application I found.
I think what I meant is a 25mm lens is pretty wide on a large format camera, but if you flip the switch and it went down to a Super 35 window, suddenly that's a more narrow angle of view. So the same lens, prime, becomes two different lenses in terms of angle of view.
Definitely, that can be, I did a thing with Janusz, we were in Belize on a boat with Reds, and having a limited amount of lens sets on a boat in the water, we did 8K, 4K, sometimes in 2K, because our longest lens was a 135. We wanted to get a long shot girl on a jet ski, go to 2K. We knew a reason to do it, and we knew a reason why to do it, so it definitely helped us get the shot and move faster and make our day.
And the lenses were sharp enough to sustain.
Oh, definitely, the lenses were sharp enough. Having foresight to be aware cognitively with the Reds to black shade for that resolution and frame rate is helpful.
Steve, I'm sure you have a question.
No, well, Jeff, on Instinct, for the full frame stuff, were there light rangers on the camera?
That's an interesting question. I mean, light rangers are a cine device that we use now much more regularly. Our B camera operator had a light ranger. I show now we have 3 light rangers for 4 cameras, so it's much more critical when we're shooting wide open at a 1.8 or a 2 on that large image circle to give them extra stop to really make the day, to make it. If we're doing walk-ups from 10 feet to the lens, we don't get it at a 2, I'm gonna pull the ND and we're gonna talk to the gaffer and get the shot, really.
Can you explain what a light ranger is?
Sure, a light ranger's a new tool from, I think,
Preston.
Cinema Devices.
Preston.
Preston made it themselves, I guess, and it integrates with an MDR4, and it provides you with a real-time readout of a spread that shoots out and
It's a
hits the
graphic
person.
display over the image that allows the focus puller to see graphically
Much more precise.
which way to pull the focus and what's going on.
And this
They're
is the-
pretty critical at this point for
You're
modern
using
use.
wireless controllers, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everything we're doing blue dot, pretty much. We try to use RCU4s every now and then, but it seems like most people are integrating with the Preston system.
So you're using technology to try to overcome the problem of tracking or following narrow depth of field shots.
Well, an interesting thing that Arri has done with the Fraunhofer Institute actually is they took Alexa studio camera and did RGB plus Z. So they're getting your Z axis on the optical path through the mirror in line with the sensor. So there's many interesting ways that we can get this depth space or this Z space. One of the interesting things I wanted to ask Larry about the C500 actually was if there was a way to parse the metadata from those gyros. If we can parse the metadata in the camera from those gyros, we don't need an NCAM. We can use velocity to help us. If they know a light map and have a light map for a depth cue and can say angle of incidence based on speed for a dolly shot, that helps so much in compositing. And it's all about metadata at this point. The more we can parse that metadata and get it to people in production, the better everyone's job usually goes, in my experience.
I made a similar suggestion at NAB, also to Larry. Yeah. Another question. This is an incredible panel. Yes.
More of a comment than a response to that question regarding the issue of circular pixels. For those who are old enough to remember, we used to have things called pickup tubes, like pomegans, and those had an elliptical sensor shape. It was a Gaussian elliptical sensor. Not quite circular because of the necessity to completely discharge the target on each scan. But it was an elliptical spot, it wasn't square and it wasn't round. The closest you could get to that, I think, with a modern sensor would probably be a hexagonal one. Those are the hexagonal close pack.
I certainly would love to see the end of the CMOS sensor. I think we've done enough with the bare pattern CFA. It's done great things since 1953, but we can move on. It's my hope. But whether it's hexagonal pixels or another sensor layup, I really do hope that the future is not bare specific.
Up till now, we have been victims of the traditional scan readout. The signal on the interface is lines, one after another. And, so you got a bunch of pixels and then you hit the next line. So it tends to orient itself towards having square pixel samples because you've got effectively square pixel transmission. But you can do that conversion from one type of one geometry to the other electronically with the appropriate filtering algorithms.
I mean, I like the idea of a hexagonal pixel because the surface area layout to pixels next to it would mean they could cascade over and perhaps
And
be
if you
more
go back
sensitive.
far enough on film, the final grains on the films, the T grains that Kodak developed were hexagonal.
The silver halides, you mean?
Yeah, the actual film grain itself was a hexagonal grain.
What's interesting
Randomly
is
distributed.
is my mic on?
Yes.
What's interesting is to look at that from the other point of view and look on the display side of things. Whereas with the CRT, we had the Gaussian spot profile, which is like the inverse of what you're saying was on the tube. And that provided a reconstruction filter. And one of the things I always feel is missing on the display side of stuff is we don't have the equivalent of the reconstruction filter. So in audio, when you do digital audio and you're sampling it, you take your samples at every time, but when you reconstruct back to the analog signal on the digital to analog converter, you don't just play those samples back out. You put it through a reconstruction filter, which, you know, according to sampling theory should be a sync filter, and that correctly fills in the gaps. And because there's no frequencies above the Nyquist limit, because you can have very good brick wall filters on the audio side, which we can't do on the optical side because we lack dark cons to have the negative lobes on the filters.
Yeah.
But it means on the old CRTs we have these effectively a reconstruction filter on the playout, so we've got some very, very smooth imagery that was completely non-aggressive. And the exact opposite of that is an experience I had last year at NAB where I saw the big Sony crystal display. And it was hyperreal, and I looked at it and it's like, my gosh, this is actually sharper than the reality around me. And it boggled my mind. I couldn't believe how it was appearing so sharp. And then I saw the big, I have a picture on the wall showing how the pixel works. And at the center there's this little light emitting area, and there's a larger black area around it, so you can get really good black levels. But effectively, it is the exact opposite of that. It is a point source, separated spatially rather than temporally, and no reconstruction filter. And of course, I get the feeling that, like, from sampling theory, the opposite of that, it's almost like hacking the human visual system and putting that in incredibly high NTF. And it was very visually arresting.
That's a discussion to be had with consumer electronics manufacturers.
Yeah, but I'm concerned that if that was in the cinema, which obviously is where our images end up, that might be great for a commercial and be visually arresting, but I don't know if I'd want to sit and watch a movie for 2 hours with that level of hyperreal information into my eyes.
One question in the back?
Is there any thought of using MEMS to replace a lens, like a pinhole camera at a nanoscale? Because it's always in focus, right?
In my experience in consulting with the NRO, for instance, through CACI, we use arrays of small sensors in conjunction with each other together instead of super small lenses.
But it boils down to the pixels that are really small, right? So you just, MEMS is the aperture.
So you would have a hyperfocal lens that had no focal need for focus. That would definitely be interesting to design.
Can't imagine a crew using it, though. It would eliminate some union jobs. Any other questions? Thank you, everybody. Thanks to our panel. I think this is an important discussion that they had. This is the future of the next, 10 years? I'm guessing? Yeah. Thanks for coming.